Behind the Shades.
So my name is Dr. Alea Barron. I am the Director of Client Relations at Barron Family Law, which is a family law firm. My sister is a family law attorney, and we have this amazing law firm together. She's the owner and CEO. I'm the Director of Client Relations, and we mostly focus on child custody, divorce, domestic violence, and then all sorts of trust, wills and estate planning, as well as premarital consulting and prenuptial agreements or postnuptial agreements. Those are all the rage in Hollywood right now as well. And then a little bit of background on that as well as me is I have my doctorate in psychology and my master's in marriage and family therapy from Pepperdine, which is right in Malibu. You talked about Beverly Hills earlier, so right next door neighbors to that. And from there, I was a therapist, and that wasn't just the best fit for me. So now I do family law, and it is that best of blend of both worlds where there's all this problem solving in the family law, but also that emotionality and supportive that I give to our clients.
So perfect. So take us through the genesis. How did you initially get started in this area and why?
Sure. So probably like any good therapist story, my parents got divorced. And we use that as our kitschy little tagline, my sister and I, that our family is here to protect yours. Our parents' divorce was pretty brutal. And it inspired us not only to go into the law, but psychology and try to make it hopefully a better experience, not only for our clients, but really with emphasis on the kiddos and helping parents to see that while the divorce process is very traumatic in general, but it really has a big impact on the kids. And if you can be really psychologically mindful about the process, it will lend itself to the children and better outcomes and better relationships long-term, because you're likely going to be in the room when the kids are going to prom or graduating college. And you're going to want to be there for those big moments and have both parents share in the joy of that. And it certainly makes it more difficult when parents can't be in the same room.
I know for me, when I started my journey, it was similar. It was like, I just want to be different than my parents, even though as I got older, I kind of appreciated them a little bit more. But as a kid, I thought these were like two monsters of people, right? I'm like, I want this, I want that, and I wasn't getting it. But what I found is that they were good people, and maybe their approach wasn't the best, but the effort was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish that I had the foresight to understand that talking to someone was going to be helpful instead of me bottling it in. And I think that was more of like my man pride, right? Where like, I'm a man, I can't show any weakness. But it left me in a situation where thankfully I didn't roam the streets like a lot of young people do. And I just was able to figure it out. And I use them as like my motivation. I said, I'm going to be better than my mother and my father. Let me tell you something, Alea. I made sure everything was better. If they played one sport, I played two. If they got B's or A's, I got A pluses, right? So when you're pushing through and understanding where you wanted to be, where did you pull your motivation and inspiration and from?
Yeah, that is an awesome question. And I don't know that I have been asked that recently, but I think a lot just came from this desire to want to show them I was the best version of myself. And I think along the way, maybe that initially it was like to prove, like most kids want to prove like they're good enough for their parents' love and that their parents are going to love them no matter what. And I guess maybe I didn't always feel that that was just a given, that I was just going to be loved because I'm me. I think that I felt that I needed to prove that along the way. And I think eventually it became intrinsic as part of my desire to like give back and give back to the community and give back professionally. And part of, I think, the pride I just hold in within myself is knowing that I'm a good person, that like most things I do are like to make others feel the same way I wanted to feel as a kid, like loved unconditionally, feel that empathic joy and encouragement from someone who really loves you. So I think there is a lot of like that historical component, like you were talking about with you and your family and your parents, but that now like kind of keeps me focused and motivated moving forward as well. Like it's like part of that pushes you to just want to grow and be better, especially when you see like the impact you're making in others' lives.
Did you think that you would end up exactly where you are today, or was this a little bit of doubt because, as you mentioned, you're trying to pull that inspiration and figure it all out as we got older?
No, I definitely had no idea I would be here today. I think when I was a kid, like every kid, I wanted to be a veterinarian or an astronaut. And then from there, I wanted to figure everything out about the world. I just wanted to help others. And maybe in a sense, that was like, so I didn't have to explore my own experience, right? If you're constantly helping other people, you don't have to take that look at yourself and explore your own trauma or your own grief or your own personal issues, right? Because it's so focused outward. I think I did that for a long time. And then, of course, I went and got my degree in psychology, which helped me reflect on that for myself as I was giving back. And then it was very fluid. I remember my aunt had said, "Oh, your sister's getting, she's going to be a lawyer and you're getting your master's and doctorate in psychology. You guys should really do something with that together." And I thought, oh no, I'm going to be a neuropsychologist. I'm going to study the brain. And she was going to do something completely different. And then, I don't know, probably 7 years later, it looped back around and the timing was just right. And now we are working, together to be that supportive, collaborative team for our clients. But certainly there was never a plan for that. And I'm wondering about your plan. Like, was your plan to be the host of this amazing Behind the Shades show?
Yes. No, I'm joking. well, my plan, to be honest, I just I wanted to make a difference and I didn't know how I was going to do that. So in my teens, I turned to something that was very familiar, and that was religion. And I began to give talks in front of at the time I was a Christian. I decided to give talks in front of the church and the congregation. And I know a lot of people say, oh my God, public speaking is such a big fear. But my biggest fear, let me share with you, Alea, was making sure I didn't trip going up those steps in front of all those people. Because no matter what you deliver at that point in time, it's like, well, yeah, that Bible reading was good terrain, but we saw you fall. So when I learned how to do that and I was able to overcome that and command that presence, because there is nothing potentially more powerful than speaking from the heart to those who are loving what you're hearing, especially from the good book. And then I stopped for a minute and then I needed to do something that I could pay the bills with. So I got into the banking industry, but my love was always speaking to people. And then when we had the lockdowns, I was like, Turing, you're given another opportunity. You're given one with the church, you're given two through the banking industry, and now you're giving a third. And I was like, I have to answer this call to action from whomever it's coming from, for those who are religious, from God, from me internally. And that's how I started this podcast. And I look back at all the guests, yourself included, and it's truly amazing how many people will tell their story, and all you have to do is ask and put a microphone in front of their face. So that's how I got involved in it.
Okay, that is, I think, also very inspirational because it wasn't a plan and you just did it. And now here you are. I mean, I think that takes a lot of courage, but also that dedication and drive. I think, like we were just referencing, that it's something that's internal and then sometimes also that's learned. And you can also train yourself. Like if you want to start a podcast, like you could go and do it if that was something that was motivating to you.
Yes, I agree. And I think what sometimes happens, unfortunately, is we let affordability and income get in the way of our passion, because passion is a lot different than purpose. So passion could be that, Alea, your passion from our conversation is that you want to make the world a better place than how you entered it, right? And that's my passion too, but we go about it two different ways. Our purpose is something else. It could be our purpose to do this to pay our bills. It could be our purpose to do something else. Our purpose is more of the thinking and the logical aspect, where our passion is what's in our heart, what's in our soul. And when I hear how you're helping people, relationships are so difficult. There's some relationships I failed at. There's some relationships I succeeded at. But overall, I think I have a passing grade on my overall experience. I hope so anyways, right? Don't speak to my exes here. But but when you look at how you want to help people with their relationships, are you pulling from your own personal experience, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that there is like a variety, right? I think in the legal world where I'm working with the law clients, and part of my role is to do the case management and case conceptualization, but a lot of time I'm doing damage control, like talking with the parents who are going through so much, and the kiddos are going through a lot, and they're trying to balance work and life and their ex partner, and you'd be having a new partner, and all the emotions that are coming from just so many changes all at once, right? And maybe a change that they weren't expecting or ready for, and it kind of got dropped on them. So also that lack of control and the grief around just losing themselves and having to find themselves and who they thought they were, but now that role is changing, and it can happen so fast, right? So part of my role is to jump in there and be able to have the conversation that is coming up for them that may not necessarily be in a legal context, right? They're not asking for legal advice. They're not saying, okay, like, what's the next step for my divorce? But it's really like, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to get through the next day, the next week, till my next court hearing? How do I support my children? How do I help my children understand what's going on, not that they have to go to two houses? So I come in and really kind of do that supportive role around, okay, where are you? Like, what supports do you need? And then how do we get you from this place of feeling out of control and grieving to a place where you feel emotionally capable of sitting down with your kiddo and saying, like, I can't talk to you about the court case, right? Because that's not what this is about. This is about, two parents that love their children or child. And how do we get that parent to not be crying, to not show that emotion, so that way the kiddos don't blame themselves, right? Because so many kids think if their parents don't work out, it's something they did, and that they need to fix their parents. So it's really getting parents into that place where they can be emotionally available to be a good parent and co-parent to that child. So that way there isn't so much animosity. And hopefully, the kiddos, come out confident, and they can see that both parents love them. So that is a lot of the role and the dynamic that I play here. And I think that helps facilitate, these stronger dynamics for the relationships. And I think our clients feel that we truly care about them as humans, as opposed to just like another legal case along like the legal, court hearing and just the case calendar.
Do you find that difficult to balance that to areas where you want to make sure that they feel nurtured and respected and they're cared for, but as well as there's that legal aspect where you're trying to balance between both?
Sure, right. Well, every, client wants to feel like their case is the most, important as far as like they're going to win. And I think, in family law, especially, it's like who's losing less, because it's so much of this balancing act, how the assets are being divided, where the children are going to be. And I do think that the balance, like at least for us in the way we work at our law firm, is we have the attorney, or we have a couple of attorneys, and we have the paralegals, and their role really is to focus on those legal aspects. And that is the focus, is to make sure that people feel that their case in the court is being addressed, and the legal ramifications and their legal rights are being upheld to the highest extent. And it's like that both and they're getting that support where they know that the decisions they're making are based in the context of like what is in their long-term best interest, not just like right now, like, oh, are you going to win this settlement? But what is the what are the emotional ramifications as well? How do you get through this as unscathed as possible, right? Because it's very traumatic usually for everyone, especially if it's going to court. As an aside, we do very peaceful, private out of court settlements for divorces and child custody where parents are coming just to make sure their paperwork is done right. But those aren't the ones that are making the newspaper headlines, right? Like the people that are getting along aren't really going to court, that are having so much of the drama, if you will. And then there's always the factor that, sometimes one or both parties have a mental health or substance use issue, which is why it's getting so out of hand and why people aren't necessarily taking all of the steps they can to be the most healthy in these dynamics. So it's kind of helpful to come in, especially in domestic violence scenarios or these high conflict custody cases where, usually there's more going on than just the case itself. And I'm sure you're curious about that since that's a big part of your role.
I am, and that's why I have so many questions, but I want to narrow it down. So I guess my first question is, how does someone protect themselves from being quote unquote taken to the cleaners when there's that separation period between two people and it ends up in court?
Sure. And I think like taken to the cleaners can mean so much depending on if you're, and I'm guessing you're kind of talking about that financial aspect. And I think that's really tough because every state has a different law around how you could divide assets and debts. And I'm not super familiar with the Canadian laws. But I imagine, you have to really try ahead of time to be aware of the finances. Like if you don't know, if you think that you might be going through a divorce, or really just like for one's own sense of autonomy and understanding of who they are and where they are in a relationship, to have that ownership over their finances and knowing what the familial finances are, I think is really helpful. Because if you don't know what's there, you don't also know what's being hidden. And it certainly takes a lot of money to unearth hidden finances if they are being hidden. So I would encourage anyone, if they don't have ownership or access to the finances, to maybe start to be curious about that and why that is, and kind of get in there to, be on the credit cards, know what the taxes are, know what the tax returns are, make sure that you're signing the paperwork. We see people that have never signed their tax return, been married for 5 or 10 years. And those are things that should be signed by both parties. So whether or not their signature is being forged or they just thought the other person was taking care of it, to really take ownership and, access your own finances, because that is where people really get snookered, is when they don't know.
So for me, I do understand that the laws are a little bit different in California versus Canada, as well as all across the United States. I think California, is it no fault divorce?
Correct. Yeah.
Correct.
Hey,
Perfect.
you know a lot.
Yeah, I keep my eye on American news. So for those who don't know, explain what no fault divorce means and its impact, if you can, please, in general, of course.
Yeah, certainly. So I think sometimes it's helpful to kind of look at it for what it isn't, right? Like people think like, oh, that my partner cheated on me. It's their fault. We're getting a divorce. So like, what am I going to get in return for them being a bad actor in this scenario? So what no fault means is the other person doesn't have to do anything to require like a reason for the divorce to occur. So you could just say like, you know what, this relationship isn't working for me and I would like to get divorced now. And so that means that nobody is at fault. And that could mean the other person stole the entire retirement account. That could mean the other person was having an extramarital affair. That could mean they were a criminal and they were doing all this theft, right? There's no fault. It just means the divorce is going to happen. And then from there, how do the assets and debts get divided? And that means they'll get divided 50-50 because there's nobody is at fault. There are some states that are at fault states. I'm not sure what they are off the top of my head, but So say a person was cheating on their spouse, that might mean there's maybe more limited funds that would be then available to that spouse who was cheating. I don't really want to speak to that because I'm not sure of how all of that works in those states, but at least in California, when we hear no fault, it means 50-50 is from the date of marriage to the date of separation. And that is very surprising to many individuals because they believe that if they have credit cards in their own name, if their debt is their debt, or if they have a retirement in their name, that all the contributions to their retirement is their retirement. But really what happens is when the divorce occurs, things do become 50-50, whether that's holistic, like looking at the combined total assets and debts, or each individual, like line item by line item, like the home or the car or the retirement, how those get divided 50-50, will then be 50-50. It's not the car was purchased in my name, so it's mine. And that is really surprising for many people.
Yes, I can definitely see that, because I know the joke, at least in some of the online communities, is that they look down on California for that reason, right? Even though California is one of a few states in the states that has the no fault, because some people view it as the other person can literally wake up and be like, Train, I don't like you today. I want a divorce. Whereas some other areas, some other places, you actually have to prove, right? Some places it's like infidelity, it's some type of abuse, things like that. Or if you're really like old school, right? Probably like our grandparents' age, and they're thinking, no one leaves a marriage. It doesn't matter what I'm doing to you, what's happening. We make the world think that we're a happy couple. And now we've progressed quite a bit to say that it's okay to be divorced. It's not necessarily a bad thing as maybe it was, where if someone was a divorcee, you didn't really want to touch them, right? You're like, you can't make your marriage work, so you're like damaged goods. It's like being a single mother, for example, right? It's like hands off. So when you're speaking, if you were to put on, I know that you're helping them on the law aspect, but you also have the therapist background as well. When you put on that hat, is there a little bit of consoling, or at least understanding from the emotional side when you're helping these people, even though you're now on the legal side of things?
Sure. Yeah. So that is like a large part of my role, right? Like as a director of client relations, my role is really to do the emotionality component around that, holding the space for someone who is going through the divorce. So whether that is, talking about the child custody, if that is talking about the division of assets and debts, and what may be occurring around what is fair, isn't fair from a financial point of view, what one may feel is fair from a parenting point of view. And certainly we work with those in domestic violence scenarios, and, just kind of the emotional weight that one carries when they're in like a very extreme or violent scenario, whether that's emotional violence, physical violence, financial control, the coercive control. You were talking about social media and what's in the news, but social media is being a tool now for harassment, stalking, posting about someone that may or not be true, using videos and photos that are not consented to, and kind of really supporting someone's emotions around how really unfair the laws are now, because they haven't caught up with social media, right? I mean, I think that the judges have wide discretion to kind of put safeguards in place if it's brought to their attention, but to get someone to stop texting you 50 or 60 times a day, to, still, be able to have a record of it, but then also not to have it in your face, to be able to block them. There is this like very hard balance, right? To how you encourage a client to maintain their sanity while they're being sent message after message, or, negative posts are being posted online that, aren't being taken down or are up for public consumption. And then to also encourage them to say like, well, your therapist might tell you to block that person, because it's not emotionally, supportive for you, and having them in your inbox, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, text message, maybe that's not healthy for you to receive those. And it would be good to block them out. But then, working in the legal world, it's like, oh my gosh, please don't block them, because then we won't have record of, their bad behavior. And we're need to show the judge that. It's this very fine balance, encouraging them from this emotional point of view to anger, anguish, and fear even. And also, have that be like available for their legal case. So I think there is that balance. And I do think it is interesting, from being on both ends, wanting to support someone and be like, yeah, you should block them, because like no one deserves to be treated that way. And like, okay, like maybe get a new cell phone number and then keep that phone on, but don't look at it. So that way we can have record of all of these messages or phone calls that they're sending you.
A girl I used to date many years ago, since you mentioned up the texting and the calling, I can't even remember how many times, but she called and texted so many times that I called my service provider at that time. And I said, hey, what are my options here? Because I'm getting these calls from this number. And it was a young lady on the other end. And she's like, is someone stalking you? Someone harassing you? And I kind of like chuckled, right? Because I guess they're so used to it, like the phone companies. And she kind of chuckles, I kind of chuckle. And then it just made me feel better, because when you actually think about it, it is kind of ridiculous that like as adults that we would actually behave that way. But I think sometimes, as you mentioned, like when you put on the therapist coach hat, it's like it drives you crazy when you're receiving it, because you feel, at least for me, I felt like it was such an invasion of my life. Like here I am, I'm about to call, let's say Alea, or text Alea, and I go to my phone and that number pops up again. And it's one of those things where it's like you want to put in your phone, like when you change the name to don't answer, she's crazy. It's like one of those things. And it's interesting that you mentioned that. So from the legal standpoint, it's in the best interest to leave it if you can, because you can use it as evidence further. Is that my understanding?
Sure. Yes, because it's a record, and the courts do use text messages and call logs as a record for harassment. So whether it's a co-parenting issue or a domestic violence issue, if you're sending too many messages in a row without a response, that isn't requiring of a response. There's always the caveats, right? Like if you're messaging the co-parent about like something that's going on with the kiddo and it's urgent, right? A number of messages would be appropriate. But, in a case where someone hasn't messaged you back in 3 or 4 days and you're getting, 15 to 20 messages, or what we see usually more, in a short time span over like a week or so, and there's been no response, or maybe there's been a polite response, please don't message me anymore, thank you. The courts will take that into consideration, or as, harassment, or potentially keeping someone under surveillance, trying to find out where they are, seeking a response, or especially if the messages themselves are threatening. Like, why won't you answer me? If you don't answer, I'm going to come to your house, or, you better answer, or, ones that are maybe more direct on what a threat might look like. But just the sheer number of text messages could be considered harassment or disturbing one's mental peace as well.
Alea, where were you about 2.5 years ago when I had people saying, right? I had people telling me they're going to show up to my house. Where were you?
Yeah, it sounds like your mental peace was disturbed once or twice. And I imagine some of your listeners may not be aware that is emotional harassment, and it is harassment, and a court of law could look at that and, depending on how extreme the messaging is, take that into consideration when they may give someone a restraining order. So it is, I think, good to be mindful of, especially for ourselves, right? Because in an emotional state, we can all, even the best of us, can be put in a place where we might think sending a few messages back to back, feels right. And like we're letting out our emotions and we're being honest. And I think, a lot of times we hear in the media or, even in therapy, like, it's good to write a letter or like get that cathartic, experience out. But it's good to be mindful of, because you don't want necessarily to be perceived in a way where you're also being like threatening or harassing. And I think the bar is moving a lot, and you don't necessarily always know where that bar is, and to kind of really be mindful about anything you put down in email or in text message, because the court system like will and can like use it as evidence. And, you may think that you're just showing someone how much you love them, and they may not be interpreting that information in that same way. Like it might be received in a different way. And I think that, it's good for everyone to be aware of, like whether you're a victim of that experience and you don't want to be a victim or a survivor of that any longer, as well as like you don't want to be the perpetrator, even if it's like well-intentioned, right? Even like to coworkers, this is not even in, romantic relationships, coworkers, family, friends can all be put off by messages that we think are well-intended and maybe lengthy. And so I think it's just good to be like considerate of that, because certainly I'm thinking of like workplace scenarios, like where if someone's getting too many messages, even from a coworker, they may feel that that's intrusive or invasive, and you don't know where somebody's boundaries are.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I always found it difficult to establish that boundary when it came to harassment, because what is harassment to me may not be harassment to you, and what's harassment to us may not necessarily be harassment to the court of law, for example, right? And I think sometimes, because when you go by the hard definition in the dictionary, it's something that like that happens 2 or more times. So for example, if I say that Jane down the street is pretty, I'm not harassing her. If I just say it once and she's like, oh, thank you, Terrain, but I don't appreciate that, and I stop. Whereas some people now, it's a little bit different. It's not necessarily the action. I think sometimes it's, okay, how does it, I interpret it this way without the clarification, because you don't really know anyone's intention until you may ask them or you get inside their head, right? And you also made a good point where you want to make sure that you can demonstrate that it actually is harassment, meaning that the endless text messages or emails from a coworker at work, or someone is always in your space, even though you've let them know. How much of the burden of identifying the harassment piece is on the person who's experiencing it?
So the burden, at least in the family law court in California, is on the person filing for, like, say, a domestic violence restraining order. So if I was being harassed, right, I would have to prove to the judge that I was being harassed, right? Which is why I would need all those text messages and phone logs. It wouldn't be on them to prove that they were innocent by them providing their phone logs or their text messages. So it would be on my end, right, to prove that. However, that's like why like the record keeping is important. And I think that's where the law and the psychology are kind of in conflict, because, you know, most therapists, I think, would say, like, block this person, like, make sure they don't have access to you, like, you know, keep that peace of mind for yourself. But then if you're the person having to prove that the abuse is occurring and you don't have any proof, you're just like, well, they were messaging me or they were calling me, but then I blocked them, you know, then your proof has kind of dissipated. You know, and I think that does put the person, if you will, like the person surviving that abuse, in a really challenging and emotional place. Because how can they prove without the evidence, but then how also do they protect themselves emotionally, which is like what you and I are here for, right? Like, how do we help someone be their best selves and then also still say, like, yes, keep incurring the abuse, like keep, you know, just look at how many times they're texting you and try not to read it, just, but how is that, possible when you're receiving like threatening messages, and in the family law court, it's very different than the criminal court, right? So if you're guilty, you get a chance, you're innocent until proven guilty, but in the criminal court, there's an investigator going and trying to assist one in proving that. In the family law court, you're having to prove that this is occurring without the assistance of a professional. So I do think it puts people in a bind. And I imagine this is the same like in workplace violence, and probably even in non-romantic relationships, even friendships that, go south, or, in the instance of coworkers, just even if it seems innocent. And I think, we were kind of talking about like definitions, like the definition for me of what feels intrusive, invasive, or like someone stepping over my boundary, like may be very different for you. And certainly that's always in context of, race, religion, ethnicity, LGBTQ issues, like, and who you are as a person, how you were raised. I mean, just really everyone has their own cultural context of what feels intrusive. And I think we are entering into an interesting space in our culture, especially, and I say this in a lot of times, like with social media, there's a lot more access to a person or to whom you think the person may be, right? The social media version of me is not who I am if we were to go to dinner, because that's just, social media is not reality. Some people may put a lot on social media, but that doesn't mean that's the true nature of who that person is.
And I will 100% agree with that, because there's times where by the definition, I could have said, you know what, this was harassment that I experienced. But then when I sit back and I think about it, I didn't feel harassed, if that makes sense. And that's how I was trying to navigate some of the situations that I was in. And I think sometimes people may experience that. They may think that it's harassment, but they don't feel that it is. And they may not think it's harassment, but they feel that it actually is. And as you mentioned, it puts yourself in a difficult situation, because if you're trying to prove it, depending on the burden of proof and which court system that you're in, you open yourself up to this type of energy, this type of situation, and who knows how you're going to end up reacting. Because let's say if you have some type of trauma as a child that's unresolved, and now you're trying to prove that this person is harassing you, and you feel that you have to let it continue just to say that, hey, so-and-so over there has been harassing me. Is there a point where, after everything is said and done, is there like a referral system to make sure that these victims are okay when it comes to this?
Maybe we can whittle the question, like your question, down a bit as far as like our clients, or are you just kind of talking more generally, like if one were to experience harassment, like is there a way for them to seek assistance? Because I think that's like multi-level.
I'm thinking in general, because I want to make sure, and this is for everyone listening, we're not giving you legal advice at the moment. Right? I just want to make sure that in general, how we may be assisting these clients in ways that maybe outside of our relationship. So for example, I can have these conversations with someone, but if someone gets emotional, depending on the type of care or attention that they need, I may not be able to provide it. So I'd say, hey, have you thought about maybe doing this? Is that a conversation that in general people can have?
Oh, sure. I think so. And I think it's super important. I think whether you're a friend or you're in a role where you are lending an ear that like a professional ear, and it doesn't have to be even in a legal sense, right? It just could be as, you and your podcast and your professional role, or me and my professional role, but not as an attorney. How do we assist those, feeling like they need extra supports? And I think there are multi-level supports depending on where the potential harassment or threats are coming from, right? And I think, of course, calling the police if you feel like you're unsafe is like the most important thing to always remember. There's non-emergency lines. So if you're like questioning like whether something rose to the level of like needing someone to come to your home and protect you, like, certainly you can call ask the police questions like, hey, like I'm experiencing all these text messages. Like, is this enough to file a police report, right? Or if you're getting phone calls or someone is driving by your house, like the police will give you that information from that criminal perspective. But I think as professionals like you and I, does this person need more psychological supports? Do they need increased therapeutic sessions? Do they need increased coaching or consulting sessions to kind of give them that extra support around the feelings they may be having? Or do they need to be referred, say, to like a community outreach center? I mean, I know here we have the Family Justice Center, we have Weave, we have My Sister's House. You know, there's different institutions here in Sacramento where, you know, someone could go to, whether they're a man or a woman, and seek assistance around like feeling that their space is being violated or they're feeling infringed upon, and have those additional support and resources from that community base. But I think in general, having records of whatever it is, you know, for one's own ability to just like reflect and look at like what is occurring, and is that a boundary that, you know, would they want to continue that relationship moving forward if those boundaries are, you know, being violated. You know, it's good to reflect on that, even if you're just talking to a friend. You know, like if a friend came to me and said, look at all these messages, you know, you'd be like, ooh, yikes, like that doesn't look like a healthy relationship. So, you know, being able to talk with a friend about, you know, do you think that's healthy? Is that appropriate? Like, do you feel like your boundaries are being violated? I guess really having that curiosity around where they are. And it kind of goes back to what you and I said, you know, we're all in a different position on what we feel is where someone has overstepped that boundary.